Okay, my name's Kapil Dudakia. Uh, I currently am a business consultant. I work on international projects, working mostly between India and Europe and the UK. Born in Mombasa a long, long time ago. Didn't stay there for too long, and before I was even a few years old, we had moved across to Nairobi. And whilst I was going to a primary school in Nairobi, we heard the news that the East African exodus was just about to take place. I never understood it at that time. It took me many, many years before I figured out what it was all about. But we came across, I think, February or March of 1968 to the UK. I think I was about 8 years old, something like that. And obviously, Great Britain is in fact my home, always has been from that day onwards. We settled in Bolton, obviously the nugget of the Northwest, as we would like to believe it to be, the place where all the great people come from. But no, Bolton was a town full of factories. The factories were clothes factories, spinning factories. This is what, in fact, even Mahatma Gandhi in his days actually talked about the factories of the Northwest, and that's what he actually meant. And so we went to Bolton, grew up in a two up down terrace property there, went to a local primary school, had absolutely no idea about the education sector here. Obviously, very, very different. The styles were different, the methodologies were different, expectations were different. Fortunately, Dad had actually made sure that at least I had a little bit of English medium education in Nairobi. So I had some knowledge of English, but otherwise it was trying to pick up the nuances of English whilst you're growing up. And it was a great life, but it was a tough life, and there were many, many things that one would wish to forget because society at that time was not accommodating to people from foreign lands. They were not used to it. I understand and appreciate why, but I was only a child. I was not to know. And it took years and years before I actually figured out what they meant by racism. Because I grew up in a family where everything was equal. There was no notion of being prejudiced because your color is different or you come from a different faith or anything like that. You know, my father's friends were from every single type of background you can think of. So all I saw was this total diversity around me, and I came here, and little did I understand why youths gangs of 10, 15, 20 would chase me down the road from school, beat me up. I mean, I remember an incident once I came home, everything torn, and said to my father, they just beat me up. Obviously, he said, you must have done something. And I said, honestly, I have done absolutely nothing wrong. That's when the penny started to drop, that in fact there is something called racism. But then you cope with it. You know, it's not a good life. It's not nice going to school, not knowing if on the way back or on the way there, someone's going to attack you or groups are going to attack you. You can fight one person, two person, but if there's 10 or 15, it's very, very difficult. I think it was in our DNA to be tough. And in every generation that I can think of in the Dudakias, there was always one person who was extremely headstrong. So in my generation, I think it was me. I otherwise known as the naughty one, but being headstrong. So just because someone attacked you or someone did something didn't mean I was going to let go. It just spurred me on, and I always knew I was better. For some reason, maybe it was upbringing or something like that, but I was better than the sum of my parts, and I could do more than that. There was never ever any pressure from the parents that I had to go into this profession or that profession. They might have actually had hopes and wishes, but that is different to pressure. Education in those days, as far as the East African nations were concerned, the first exodus, the second exodus was the Ugandan exodus. The first one was, in fact, the Kenyan one. The majority who came, when they went into education, that history of education for most families was not there. So even the parents were not in a position to actually advise their children, do this, do that, do the other. These are the subjects that you got to do. The children actually had to fall on their feet and figure out what was good for them. But our options were open. I didn't want to be an accountant. I wanted to be a surgeon, but I was never good at biology, so that's obviously a hindrance. I wanted to be a pilot, but I didn't have very good eyesight, so obviously the people on a plane would not be very happy with me if I was flying it. So
stop you just 1 second here. Okay, we're running again.
Okay, so Dad always made sure that we had all the options open to us. There was never any pressure to go down any particular route. My options were limited to what I was good at. And what I was good at was science. I was good at physics and maths. What I had never realized was these were, in fact, the two toughest subjects that everyone hated. But for me, they were just natural. I just found a lot of comfort in those subjects, and I understood maths and physics more than I understood the rest of the world, basically. So I continued with my studies, eventually went to university. I believe I was the first in our whole family to actually attend a university. So that was the first. And it was a big milestone. It was at University College Cardiff. Had I known that it was one of the top universities, I might not have applied. But being who I am, we just applied at that age. They called me in, and I started studying electronic engineering. Again, that was a hobby of mine. I didn't want to go into a university and do a course that I was not happy with. I always knew that if I had the knowledge and the skills, those can be applied to almost anything out there. What I had to do was to make sure I had critical thinking, the ability to analyze, to dissect a problem, solve a problem. Those were the biggest skills. And that was something I was very good at. And the university brought that forward. I think the Gujarati mindset has always been very open to options as opposed to a closed way of thinking. Once your ability to think outside of the box is literally ingrained in you right from the word go, then you actually see the world very differently. What people see as problems, you see as opportunities. What people see as, can I survive? You actually see that as, yeah, I will survive, because that's going to be an achievement. So the nuances changes, and that actually opens up doorways that are normally closed for most people. In those days, my father went through a tough time. However, he opened the doors. He went, banged his head against those doors until they broke down. He created the environment, which I saw. We observed how hard they had to work, both mom and dad, day in and day out. I was the eldest, so I knew exactly the sacrifices they were making. And when I went to university, that was the biggest day of his life. When I got the degree, he could not stop beaming smile. I mean, literally, he wanted to talk to everyone out there about his son. Everything that he could have achieved, because he had a brilliant mind. He never had the chance, but he gave me the chance. And I have to say that this country gave me a chance, because whilst there were issues in those days, the one thing we can't forget is we had stability, we had peace, we had opportunity, we had education. That had we stayed in Africa, of the 4 siblings, my father can possibly afford one person to be sent overseas for education, which means that one is educated, the other 3 don't get the choices, and that can create family conflict in years to come. So we all got educated. I became electronic engineer. I then went on to do a PGC in education. I became a teacher of maths, physics, and information technology. I rose up the ladder fairly quickly, purely because my subjects were so strong that all my options were open. And it wasn't very long before I was appointed an inspector of schools. And after that, Ofsted came in. I took the preliminary examinations and everything else, and HMI and Her Majesty felt that I was good enough to be an Ofsted Inspector. So I was appointed as an Ofsted Inspector for both primary and secondary phases, and I did inspections up and down the country with my team of inspectors for many, many years. My second brother, he's a graphics designer, really fantastic artist. He loves his job. He won't do anything else other than that job. And he's absolutely content with that particular job, purely because it actually allows his artistic nature to come out. My youngest brother, he likes buildings and architecture and so on. So he went into design, and he actually now works with large companies on building sites, making sure that the plans are being put into place and so on. So all of us got something out, and we moved on. Not all the people who came took the opportunities. So, for example, in my year group, when we were progressing, I suppose out of every 100, let's say, Gujaratis in Bolton who were going through the education system, maybe 3 or 4, maybe 5 actually managed to get and push themselves to university. And the reason was not that they were not capable. There was no one at home pushing them to go to university, because in those days it was get a job and get an earning, get the money into the family, because they were still struggling. The next generation, which is my children and that generation, was very different, because everyone by this stage actually said education is the route forward, and they went. So the proportion of Gujaratis or Indians or Asians, doesn't matter which proportion you take, has actually increased dramatically as far as further higher education and postgraduate studies are concerned. And in fact, we now dominate as far as British universities are concerned. Proportionate to the population, we represent around 1.5% to 2% of the population. Go to university, and we represent 8, 10, 12% of that university population. Well, in the old days, migration occurred in 2 ways. From the west, the migration occurred to the east because they were ruling us. So the migrants from England who came to India or Africa were coming there as masters. They were not coming there as slaves. Our people who were migrating westwards in those days were migrating as skilled workers, but they were not migrating as owners or in fact the masters. They were still, regardless of where they were, treated almost like slaves. So that was the early migration. That built into their mindset that we are inferior, they are superior. Once you actually have this mentality that you cannot actually escape from, even with the best will in the world, you can't do much about that. But the generation after, that's my generation, we never had any, we didn't worry about anyone. Because in my class, in mathematics, I was the best. I was the only Indian in my class. Everybody else was white, basically. I beat them at almost everything. Didn't matter which subject it was. English was a bit tough initially, but eventually I beat them at English as well. So the only thing I knew was that I'm better than you, because I've proven myself. So I think our generation and the next generation have such confidence that we're now going to convert the confidence into political reality. This is now our home. This is a nation that has actually brought us in. We've given a lot to the nation. The nation has actually given back a lot to us as well. This symbiotic relationship is so good now that we now must take it to the next tier, which is what the Jews did. When the Jews came in the 1930s, they were in the East End, literally working like slaves. Now, proportionately, if you actually look at the number of people of Jewish faith who are actually in our parliament, something like 80, 90 MPs. Now, they represent, 450,000 people in the UK? Now, proportionately, that's mind-boggling. If we got something to learn, that's the community we got to learn from, because they know, A, how to put the roots in, B, how to contribute, C, how to make money, and finally, how to grab power. You don't have to grab power, but at least take part in power. And I think our Communities are now learning that and saying we must now become a political reality. We now got people like Saileshwara, Priti Patel, and a lot of the others are now coming through. These are, Priti Patel is now the next generation. And in the next election, 2020, I would not be surprised if we see 20 plus MPs of Indian origin. And now, that is something that no one ever thought was going to be possible. Once you get into that realm, it means that the community has now got a voice which is an extra voice. Not only are we contributing, but we are actually making sure that the well-being of this nation is being protected. We're not having things done to us. We're making sure that we are, in fact, the agents of change as well. C.B. Patel is a family friend of ours, and obviously he's the pioneer when it comes to Asian news in the UK is concerned. So his Gujarat Samachar and Asian Voice were the two publications. Father used to get the publications. I couldn't read the Gujarati one, but I could read the English one. And I used to get frustrated because people were talking, frankly speaking, nonsense. You can voice your outrage and so on, but at least use your brain. What will you do next? So I started writing letters to the editor. In fact, challenging CB and his mentality as well. Very often, there came a time when he himself actually contacted me and said, "Look, why don't you start a column?" And I said, "I will, but there's a condition." And he said, "What's the condition?" I said, "My column, my rules, no censorship. No one touches my articles. They come to you. If you don't like one word, then the whole article you have to put in the bin. But you cannot change even one word." And that was a condition on which I started. And people who know my column, Kapil's Khichdi, will know that it is one of the most politically charged columns in this country from the ethnic minorities. I mean, right now I know that every time I write, the Prime Minister's media people read it, the opposition read it, politicians read it, because most of the politicians know who I am, because I've grilled them in the past very, very severely about everything. And people up and down the country read it, and I enjoy probably a following in the Gujarati community that many people would wish they actually had.
So through this writing, you consider yourself as a change agent, I suppose.
Yes.
Make a difference
Yes.
and making people understand issues.
My job, I'm not PC. I have no time for people who are PC. I detest people who are PC because I think they have created most of the mess in this world and most of the mess in this country as well. When you stop people and their ability to express themselves, it stays in. When you stop a group of people doing that, it stays in. When you stop a nation, it's only a time when the pressure cooker goes up. My view is totally the opposite. Sometimes it's not nice to hear bad things. I would rather you said it to me. If you don't like me, tell me. If you don't like me because I'm a slightly different color, say so. But at least I know where you stand and I know where I stand, and I'm much straightforward. So my column basically would out a lot of the politicians, a lot of these so-called decision makers. I would tell them what I thought of them. If I thought a policy was stupid, I would actually say so. And I would not hold back using the full extent of the English vocabulary in explaining to them my disgust, if disgust was there. Not just with the UK, but also with other countries around the world, including India. I have to say that in the early days, the only way of communicating was by airmail. I would see my mother and father write a letter, and would receive a response a month later. When the letter came, either from my mother's parents or my father's parents or whoever it was, the family would gather around the sofa. It would be opened, and Dad would actually read the letter in Gujarati, because none of us could read Gujarati, obviously. We grew up in England, so we're English now. And we would listen to what was going on. That was the only real connection. It wasn't as if you can make a phone call, because No one actually had a telephone in the home or anything like that. However, since then things progressed, and my first trip to India was 1978, just before I went to university. I just came home one day and I said to my father, what do you think if I went to India? We've got some friends going, so I can go with them. And he said, okay. I don't think he even thought longer than that. My mother was traumatized at the mere thought that her son, who had never ever set foot outside, I mean, as soon as I got to England, I'd never set foot outside of England, was now going to go to India, which is basically a completely, utterly foreign country. How will this chap survive? And I spent 10 weeks in India when I learned that I was Indian. That's when I understood completely who I really was, that I was an Indian from India originally, that I was a Hindu, that I was from a Sanatan dharmic background. I understood the greatness of the heritage that my parents had brought me into. That's when the magnitude of what I represented actually dawned on me. And that actually made me a much, much better person. Up until that stage, I was neither white, I was neither English, I was neither anything, and you were lost because you did not have a grip on your own history. Once I got that grip, I studied a lot and I understood a lot. And yes, after all these years, I can say that I can hold my own when it actually comes to my ancestral heritage. So yes, since then we've been there many, many times. And in fact, as I mentioned to you, as a business consultant, I work mostly with India. This is the toughest place to do business in. Even the big, large multinationals can't break in. But if they want to break in, they will need to come and see people like me, people who know and understand the psyche of not just India, but if you want to go into Gujarat, the psychology is different if you want to go to Maharashtra, or if you want to go to Karnataka, or Andhra Pradesh, or Telangana, or you want to go to any of the other states. It is very, very different. And you've got to have a feel for India right at the microcosm level, not at the macro level. I'm very happy that I've actually got that now.